I've always had a strange fascination with darkness, not the comfortable kind you find in a bedroom at night tucked under a blanket, but the kind of darkness that makes you feel invisible, exposed, and utterly alone. London, 1942, was the perfect kind of darkness. Blackouts were routine. Every streetlight, every sign, every window shuttered. The city tried to hide itself from the sky, from bombs, from death. But darkness has a way of hiding more than just cities. It hides monsters. They called him the Blackout Ripper, a name whispered across newspapers and among terrified women in hushed voices, as if saying it out loud might summon him. He didn't strike in daylight. He waited for the sirens, the dim shadows, the faint glow of candlelight. And he struck with speed, brutality, silence. I first heard about him through my uncle. He was a young man stationed nearby, and his stories came in fragments, half warnings, half confessions. He told me about women attacked in their own homes, screams muffled by blackout curtains, footsteps echoing down empty streets. He said some who survived swore they saw a figure vanish into the night, a shadow among shadows, leaving nothing behind but fear. My fascination didn't last long. I was 17 and walking home from work along a deserted street. Most of London slept. The air had the faint metallic tang of rain-soaked asphalt. I was carrying a small package of groceries, nothing valuable, but in that moment it felt like the world on my shoulders. That's when I noticed him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the streetlights, or rather, the lack of them. A shape in the shadows, standing perfectly still, watching. My heart beat a little faster. I tried to tell myself it was just someone passing through, someone trying to avoid the blackout regulations. But then the figure moved. Just a step. Just a subtle shift. And that was enough. I turned the corner to speed up, to get home faster, and my foot slipped on the wet cobblestone. That small stumble was the sound I didn't realize he had been waiting for. A hand grabbed me from behind. I twisted. He was there, cold, silent, and impossibly fast. I screamed, or tried to, but the fear locked my throat. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. No struggle, no trace, just me, shivering in the empty street. I got home and slammed the door behind me. My parents were asleep. I never told them what happened. Who would believe me? London was full of shadows during the blackout. Any story could be dismissed as nerves, as fear, as imagination. But I knew the truth. The Blackout Ripper was real. Weeks later, the newspaper carried another story. Another woman attacked. A neighbor I recognized. She survived, but just barely. The description was chillingly similar to mine. The man, or something that looked like a man, appeared from nowhere, vanished without a trace, and left nothing behind but terror. And yet, the city carried on. Lights off, sirens wailing, bombs falling from the sky. But the Ripper never slowed down. Every corner, every alley, every dimly lit street became a potential trap. And people learned a simple truth. It wasn't the bombs you should fear most. It was the darkness itself. I don't know what happened to him eventually. Maybe he was caught. Maybe he disappeared forever. But I do know that every time I see a dimly lit street, every time I feel a shadow move just beyond my vision, a small part of me remembers that night, and I remember the feeling of a hand that wasn't supposed to exist, grabbing for me in the dark. And I still walk a little faster when the lights go out. I grew up in a small town called North Hatley, on the northern shores of a lake so quiet it felt like the world ended at the tree line. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors waved as they drove past, and where the summer heat meant nothing more than long days swimming and running around in the yard. I was 7 when it happened. 7 and completely oblivious to how fragile life could be. The day started like any other. The sun burned down hard on the grass. My friends and I were playing tag in my front yard, laughing and shouting, not a care in the world. Boats drifted lazily across the lake behind us, and the smell of warm water and pine filled the air. Then we heard it. The roar of an engine, low at first, then growing louder. I looked up and I froze. A pale green car speeding straight toward us, tires chewing up the lawn. For a moment I thought it might swerve, might slow down. But it didn't. It barreled toward us like a living threat. I ran. We all ran. Pure instinct, pure survival. My friends screamed, the sound cracking through the otherwise quiet summer air. The car slammed into the tree next door, shattering branches and sending splinters flying. And that's when I saw her. She staggered out of the wreck, face and blouse streaked with blood. Young, beautiful, terrifying. And in her hands, she held a shotgun. I don't know how I kept moving. I don't know why I didn't stop. I just ran. Heart hammering, legs trembling, screaming until my throat burned. She fired once, then again. The blasts echoed in the air, but somehow, none of us were hit. We dove into the lake behind our house, water lapping over our heads, mouths filling with it as we tried to escape the sound of her footsteps, the anger in her voice. I thought it was over, that maybe, just maybe, we'd survived. But the truth, as I later learned, was far worse. The woman was furious because of my father. He'd promised her a life together only to change his mind. His betrayal wasn't something she could forgive, and in her drunken, reckless state, she decided to take revenge on those he left behind. Police came. Neighbors came. But for those minutes, we were in the water. It felt like the world had stopped, like life itself had hung in the balance, waiting to see if a 7-year-old and his friends would survive the rage of a stranger. When it was over, we were lucky, all of us. But I never forgot the way her eyes burned, the way her anger seemed to reach out through the shadows. That day, North Hatley went from being a safe, peaceful town to a place where the very ground beneath my feet had become dangerous. I often think back to that day. I think about how fragile childhood innocence is, how quickly it can be shattered. And I remember the lesson I learned standing soaked and terrified on the edge of that lake. Sometimes danger doesn't come from outside the world. Sometimes it comes from the choices people make. And there's nothing you can do to protect yourself but run and pray you survive. Even now, years later, I can still see her face, bloodied and wild, eyes filled with fury. And sometimes when I'm alone and the wind is high, I swear I can hear the faint echo of a shotgun being raised, aimed, and fired. Just for me. Small towns have a way of hiding their secrets. Sometimes it's the obvious kind, like the cracked shutters on old houses or the whispered rumors of someone who went missing. Other times, it's the kind that sits quietly in the background for decades, waiting for someone to notice the pattern, waiting for someone to piece together what really happened. Strone was one of those towns, a tiny coastal village in Scotland where the roads curled around the cliffs like they were protecting something. The people were polite, cheerful even. But there was always that unease in the air, as if the village itself had been holding its breath for over 100 years. I didn't know the story at first. My grandfather had grown up there and told me about the town when I was young, his words painting a picturesque little village with bright mornings, friendly neighbors, and fishing boats bobbing lazily in the harbor. But he also hinted at a darkness beneath it, a story that made him uneasy to tell, until he'd had a few drinks and couldn't hold it back. It started with the post office fire. October. sometime before the First World War. The entire village smelled of smoke at sunset. Flames engulfed the post office in minutes, licking at the wooden beams and spilling embers into the streets. People ran to help, but it was already too late. By dawn, the building was a blackened ruin. At first, the story seemed simple. No human remains were found in the rubble. The postmaster and his 2 assistants were missing, and it was assumed they'd fled, taking a small fortune in savings with them. The town was outraged. This was the largest crime it had seen in generations. But the truth was much darker. Decades later, on his deathbed, a man who had helped search the ruins confessed the secret that had been buried with the constable who had investigated the fire. He told the story of what really happened that morning, the part no one in Strone wanted to believe. The postmaster, Dalglish, had believed something impossible, that his assistants were no longer human, that they were beings of incredible power, a threat to the village, maybe even to the world. The kind of thing you dismiss as superstition, except Dalglish was convinced. And in a way only a man on the edge of sanity could conceive, he decided to act. He locked the post office doors. He trapped the assistants inside, and then he set the building on fire. They perished within the walls, unable to escape. The notes he left behind were rambling, filled with warnings and delusions about the power of these beings. But Dalglish believed every word. He had saved Strone, or at least he had convinced himself that he had. Constable McAllister, the man tasked with cleaning up the aftermath, made an executive decision. He kept the truth hidden. The town celebrated the supposed recovery of the stolen money, never knowing that the thieves were long dead, and the money had never been stolen at all. The secret remained buried for decades, whispered only among a few, the rest of the village blissfully ignorant. But whispers have a way of surfacing. My grandfather told me that someone even went so far as to dig up one of the assistants' graves, proving it was empty, and even decades later the story left a shadow over Strone. People walked a little slower near the post office site. Children asked questions their parents refused to answer. The town that had seemed perfect had been built on a lie, and the memory of that fire haunted the village like smoke that never fully clears. It was a lesson I carried with me long after I left Scotland. Sometimes, the scariest stories are not the ones you read in books or hear in the woods. Sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that were true, kept hidden by people who thought they were protecting you, but in reality, were only delaying the inevitable. I've never been back to Strone, not really. I've walked the roads on maps, imagined the cliffs, the harbor, the streets where people smiled in the morning and whispered in the dark. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I imagine what it would have been like to be one of those assistants trapped in that fire, knowing you couldn't escape, knowing someone believed they were saving the world by ending your life. The smell of smoke never left me after I heard that story. I didn't have a normal childhood. Not in the way most people think of childhood anyway. I grew up in rural Minnesota in the late 80s and early 90s, but unlike other kids, my summers weren't filled with video games or trips to the mall. My family lived in a religious enclave, a strict insular community where everything was filtered through faith, and the world outside was considered corrupt, dangerous, and doomed. Our mornings started at 5:30 a.m., gathered in a massive old barn that my grandfather had painted black and turned into a chapel. There were prayers, scripture readings, and lessons on why the outside world was evil. Illness wasn't treated with doctors or medicine. It was treated with fasting, laying on of hands, and calling out demons. I believed in it all, until I didn't. My little brother came down with what I now realize was pneumonia. My family prayed, fasted, and poured every ounce of their faith into trying to heal him. Miraculously, he survived. My grandfather declared it a miracle, and for a while, I believed in the power of faith above all else. Then came my grandmother. It was the fall of 1997, just before my 15th birthday. She had always been sweet, quiet, a woman who loved her family. But one evening, she snapped. She attacked my grandfather with a knife, screaming in a way I'd never heard before, a voice filled with something unnatural. Men dragged her away, wrapping cloth around her head to prevent her from biting them. She was taken to the old chapel, now a kind of makeshift hospice, where she was shackled to a bed, and that's when I realized this wasn't sickness. This was something else, something worse. For nights, my grandfather stayed at her side, laying hands on her, reciting scripture, begging God to cast out whatever had taken her over. The rest of us prayed from our homes, our voices joining in a desperate chorus of faith. At first, I thought she'd get better, like my brother had, but she didn't. She got worse. She slept during the day, but at night, her screams echoed through the cold, empty halls. It wasn't just anger or frustration, it was pure, malevolent rage. And then my grandfather discovered the truth. Leviathan, one of the demon princes described in the Bible, had possessed her. He was said to be invincible, with impenetrable scales and a breath like fire. The thought of him taking over someone's body was terrifying enough, but to watch it unfold in your own home, there are no words for that. Grandma became unrecognizable. Her eyes glowed with a terrible fury. Her voice shifted into something guttural and alien. She whispered threats, spoke in languages no one knew, and sometimes laughed in ways that didn't belong in a human throat. We were trapped in that farmhouse with her. We had no doctors, no modern medicine, just faith, prayers, and the hope that God would intervene. Some nights, I would sit in the corner of the barn, listening to her screams and praying that she would stop before dawn. Some nights, I thought I could hear Leviathan laughing beneath her voice, whispering that no amount of prayer could save us. It took weeks, weeks of sleepless nights, fear gnawing at our bones, our voices raw from constant prayer. But eventually, the entity left her. Slowly, she returned to herself, exhausted, broken, but alive. Even now, decades later, I can't forget it. The image of my grandmother writhing and screaming, the sound echoing in the black barn, the terror that no medicine or human strength could touch, just the absolute helplessness of knowing something beyond our world had claimed her. I learned two things from that experience. 1. Faith can be powerful. It can save, it can heal, and it can protect. But it has limits. 2. And more importantly, some things exist in this world that no one should ever have to confront. I don't talk about it much. People think I exaggerate, that it's a story for attention. But I know the truth. I lived it. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the wind rustles the trees just right, I swear I can hear her screams again, faint, lingering, a reminder that the darkness doesn't always stay contained.